I think the most important thing for a teacher to know is that there is evidence out there about what works better than other things. Most teachers don't know this. I would say at least 95% of teachers don't know what works.
But maybe we could talk about why they don't, and then we can go on to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a cultural phenomenon that, in general, I don't know about the rest of the world, but certainly Western people, Western intelligent people, are not attuned to evidence. Only a small section of them, people like lawyers or engineers or doctors, have made a shift away from opinion towards checking it out to see if it's true or not. So that, in law, you're unlikely to be convicted on one piece of evidence. You tend to want to bring a few bits together. Doctors wouldn't do something simply because a friend of theirs said so. Engineers, rely on laboratory testing for strength of materials and all the rest of it. But the majority of people tend to believe their own thoughts. And it's endemic. I think that if you have studied philosophy, let's say you had at the far end of it, for 2,000 years people have just expressed their opinion. Let's say, I believe this, or I agree with Plato, or Aristotle's view was, or Hume said this. And there's no requirement of coming to a conclusion on that discussion. And people can, it's almost worse, that is, a large section of what we call intellectual life involves simply expressing opinions well. And in news programs and documentaries, this idea of having the balance. So I noticed in the recent recession, for instance, they would get a left-wing and a right-wing politician to say what they thought the answer was. And the left-winger would say, we need to borrow more money and spend. And the right-winger would say, we need to borrow less money and cut. And actually it's the same debate as 1935. And somehow or other we think it's fine for people to carry on just disagreeing. And the interviewer never says, so, what evidence have you got to support your point of view? They just don't. And people feel happy with that, and they enjoy the television program, this recession, last recession, next recession. So I think it's an endemic cultural phenomenon.
Maybe we could then go on and talk about what have evidence-based researchers really found is an effective teaching.
Well, I've tended to go slightly beyond the evidence of what works. That is, we can produce a list of things which work. They tell you that they work, but they don't explain why they work. And although it's early days on the neuroscience, I think that if we take quite a simple view of the brain, we can see why these things work and why the other ones don't. That is, learning takes place when we make connections between neurons. And there are two really important components in that process. One is that all new learning, which involves understanding, requires that the new learning is linked to prior knowledge. And secondly, that the process of learning is not instantaneous, that it requires repetitions, and that it's rather inaccurate, and therefore we require feedback. And all the effective methods, nearly all the effective methods, are methods which influence that process. So if we assess our students at the beginning, rather than just starting the course, those teachers are usually more effective. If we check the language, so that we are careful to only use the language which the students are already familiar with, and if we update their language by overtly teaching them the vocabulary that we're using, and check they know words like disassociate or whatever it is we're using, then we're likely to make more progress. that if we intervene quickly on the feedback, rather than having to give them written feedback once they've handed it in and once you've marked it, and you're giving them the feedback after the point at which they can make the improvement. And if we build in repeats so that the brain has had to sort of exercise itself in the same pathway before the memory has completely faded, then we make progress.